Imagine opening your front door on a winter morning and stepping into a world where the temperature has fallen to minus 30 degrees. The landscape has disappeared beneath deep snow, rivers have frozen into solid sheets of ice, and a relentless wind races across the open countryside with enough force to steal body heat almost instantly. There is no electricity, no central heating, no insulated clothing made from synthetic materials, and no heated vehicle waiting outside. Every task, from collecting firewood to feeding livestock, means exposing yourself to conditions that can quickly become life-threatening. For most of us, surviving in such an environment would seem almost impossible. Yet for the Vikings, this was not an extraordinary disaster or an unusually harsh season. It was simply another winter. Year after year, families across Scandinavia endured months of freezing temperatures, violent storms, and painfully short days. As if that were not enough, many of them chose to settle in places where the climate became even more unforgiving. They established thriving communities in Iceland, pushed into Greenland, and continued building lives in regions where winter dominated almost half the year. Looking back today, it is difficult not to ask the obvious question: how did they do it? Popular culture usually answers with familiar images of fearless warriors wrapped in fur, charging across snowy landscapes with axes in their hands. It is an exciting picture, but it misses the real story entirely. Courage alone cannot keep a child warm through a freezing night. A sharp sword cannot stop a family from starving after months without fresh harvests. Even the greatest longship is useless if its crew cannot survive the winter before the voyage even begins. The truth is far more impressive. The Vikings survived because they gradually built one of the most effective cold weather survival systems of the medieval world. Their homes trapped heat instead of allowing it to escape. Their clothing managed moisture before it became dangerous. Their food was chosen not only to satisfy hunger, but to fuel the human body through months of relentless cold. Every decision, from the way they built their roofs to the way they stored meat for winter, reflected generations of experience earned in one of Europe's harshest environments. None of these solutions was remarkable on its own, but together they created something extraordinary. Long before the Vikings became famous as explorers or warriors, they had already mastered a far greater challenge. They had learned how to build a civilization that could survive the northern winter. And it all began with the place they called home. At first glance, there was nothing extraordinary about a Viking longhouse. It had no stone chimney rising above the roof, no glass windows to seal out the wind, and none of the modern insulation we now consider essential for surviving a northern winter. To someone unfamiliar with Scandinavian life, it might even have appeared crude. Yet behind its simple appearance was a design refined over centuries by people who understood one unforgiving reality. Every degree of warmth lost inside the house had to be replaced by burning more fuel outside it. Firewood was never unlimited. Every tree that had to be cut meant hours of exhausting labor in freezing conditions, and every unnecessary log burned today was one less available later in the winter. The Vikings therefore approached home building with a remarkably practical goal. Instead of creating larger fires, they built houses that wasted as little heat as possible. Their solution began with the walls themselves. Rather than relying on thin timber alone, many longhouses were surrounded by massive layers of turf cut directly from the ground. Each block contained dense soil held together by living roots, and between those countless fibers were tiny pockets of trapped air. Those invisible air pockets became one of the house's greatest defenses against the cold, slowing the escape of heat while shielding the interior from icy winds that could rage outside for days at a time. Even during severe weather, the temperature inside remained far more stable than the frozen landscape beyond the doorway. The roof followed exactly the same philosophy. Beneath the grass that covered its surface lay carefully arranged layers of birch bark, branches, and additional turf, each performing a different task. The bark acted as a waterproof membrane, preventing melting snow and rain from soaking the wooden structure below, while the thick turf above served as a natural blanket that trapped precious warmth inside the building. Instead of fighting nature, Viking builders allowed the earth itself to become part of the insulation that protected their families throughout the winter. Inside the longhouse, every feature served a purpose. A large central hearth provided warmth throughout the day, but the heat it produced was carefully managed rather than wasted. Smoke did not rush immediately out of the roof. Instead, it collected beneath the high ceiling before slowly escaping through roof openings, allowing much of its warmth to spread through the living space first. Even the shape of the building encouraged warm air to circulate while helping moisture leave the structure gradually, reducing the risk of damp timber and preserving the house for many years. Perhaps the most surprising source of warmth came from the animals themselves. During the coldest months, cattle were often sheltered inside one end of the longhouse, separated from the family's living quarters by little more than a wooden partition. Their body heat continuously warmed the building throughout the night, while the deep bedding beneath them slowly generated additional heat as organic material decomposed. It may not sound comfortable by modern standards, but comfort was never the objective. Every decision was made for one reason alone: to increase the family's chances of surviving until spring. Even with such remarkable homes, however, safety ended the moment someone stepped outside. Firewood still had to be gathered, animals still needed feeding, and winter travel could not simply be postponed for months. The house protected the family from the cold, but surviving beyond its walls required an entirely different system, one that every Viking carried on their own body. A warm house could protect a Viking family through the long winter nights, but every morning eventually began the same way. Someone had to open the door and step outside. The animals still needed feeding, firewood still had to be cut and carried home, fishing nets had to be checked beneath the ice, tools repaired, fences rebuilt, and journeys made between neighboring farms despite deep snow and freezing winds. Winter did not pause everyday life. It simply made every ordinary task far more dangerous. The greatest threat waiting outside was not actually the cold. It was moisture. Modern survival instructors teach that a person can remain surprisingly comfortable in extremely low temperatures if they stay dry. Once clothing becomes wet, however, body heat begins disappearing at an alarming rate, and the risk of hypothermia rises dramatically. Although the Vikings knew nothing about thermal conductivity or modern physiology, centuries of experience had taught them exactly the same lesson. Their clothing was designed not simply to keep warmth in, but to prevent moisture from becoming an enemy. Closest to the skin, many Vikings wore garments made from linen or hemp. These fabrics were excellent at drawing perspiration away from the body, preventing sweat from accumulating where it could rapidly cool the skin. During long hours of chopping wood, tending animals, or traveling across snow-covered landscapes, this simple layer quietly performed one of the most important jobs in the entire clothing system. By keeping the skin as dry as possible, it slowed the loss of body heat long before the wearer even noticed the danger. The outer layers served a completely different purpose. Wool was the material of choice, not because it was unusually thick, but because its structure made it exceptionally well suited to the northern climate. Viking wool still retained much of its natural lanolin, a wax-like substance that helped repel rain, sleet, and melting snow before moisture could soak deeply into the fabric. Even when the outer surface became damp, the tightly crimped fibers continued trapping thousands of tiny pockets of warm air around the body, allowing the garment to insulate far more effectively than many other natural materials. Every detail reflected practical experience rather than fashion. Sleeves were fitted closely enough to reduce cold drafts without restricting movement. Heavy cloaks were fastened so they protected the chest while leaving the strongest arm free for work. Long woolen leg wraps helped preserve circulation during long walks through snow, while hoods shielded the neck, shoulders, and face from cutting winds. Even simple leather shoes became surprisingly effective winter footwear when packed with wool, fur, or dried grasses that trapped additional insulating air around the feet. None of these ideas seems revolutionary on its own, yet together they formed a complete survival system that allowed people to remain active in conditions where exposed skin could freeze within minutes. The Vikings understood something that remains true even today. Clothing does not create warmth. It only preserves the warmth your body is already producing. That meant surviving the winter depended on something just as important as shelter and clothing. The human body needed enough energy to keep generating heat day after day for months at a time. Keeping warm required more than well-designed clothing in a carefully built home. Every hour, the human body burns energy simply to maintain its core temperature. And during a Scandinavian winter, that demand increased dramatically. The colder the weather became, the harder the body had to work, which meant that staying alive depended just as much on what was stored in the food cellar as on what was burning in the hearth. This is one reason the Viking diet often surprises modern readers. Today, fat is frequently viewed as something to avoid, but for a Viking family preparing for winter, it was one of the most valuable resources they possessed. Fat contains more than twice as much energy as the same weight of carbohydrates or protein, providing the body with the fuel needed to generate heat during long days of physical labor. Cutting timber, clearing snow, repairing buildings, hauling water, or simply walking through deep drifts demanded enormous amounts of energy, and every meal had to replace what the cold was constantly taking away. Producing enough food was only half the challenge. Preserving it until spring was often even more difficult. Once the growing season ended, fresh crops became scarce, and slaughtering animals without an effective preservation method would have resulted in large quantities of spoiled meat. Unlike many later societies, the Vikings could not rely on abundant supplies of salt, which remained expensive and difficult to obtain in much of Northern Europe. Instead, they perfected preservation techniques that depended on fermentation, drying, and careful storage, rather than large amounts of salt. One of their most ingenious methods involved sour weg, the acidic liquid left behind after producing cheese or skyr. Rather than throwing it away, they used it as a natural preservative. As the whey fermented, its acidity created an environment in which many harmful microorganisms struggled to survive. Cooked meat could be stored in this liquid for months, allowing families to preserve valuable food without consuming extra firewood or precious salt. It was an elegant solution that turned what might otherwise have been waste into one of the settlement's most effective survival tools. Fish provided another crucial source of nutrition. Along the cold northern coasts, it could be dried naturally in the freezing air until most of its moisture had disappeared, creating a lightweight food that remained edible for remarkably long periods while retaining much of its nutritional value. Dairy products such as skyr added protein, preserved meat supplied fat, and hearty stews combined grains, root vegetables, and stored ingredients into meals capable of sustaining people through the darkest months of the year. Every successful harvest was carefully stretched across an entire winter because no one knew how long the cold would last or whether the following spring would arrive on time. Looking back today, it becomes clear that the Vikings were doing far more than preserving food. In many ways, they were preserving energy itself. Every barrel of fermented meat, every rack of dried fish, every container of butter, and every store of dairy products represented future warmth waiting to be transformed into body heat when the frozen months demanded it most. Yet even with warm homes, carefully designed clothing, and well-stocked food stores, one final challenge remained. Winter did not simply threaten the people living inside the settlement. It transformed the entire world beyond its borders. By the middle of winter, the familiar landscape surrounding a Viking settlement had become almost unrecognizable. Rivers that carried boats during the summer hardened into frozen highways. Forests disappeared beneath deep snow, and mountain passes became corridors of ice swept by relentless winds. For many societies, such conditions would have brought everyday life to a standstill. Travel became dangerous, supplies became difficult to move, and even neighboring communities could find themselves isolated for weeks. The Vikings refused to accept winter as a season of inactivity. Instead of waiting for the snow to disappear, they learned how to use it to their advantage. Archaeological discoveries show that skis had already become an established part of Scandinavian life long before the Viking Age reached its height. These were not recreational tools, but practical equipment that allowed hunters, farmers, and messengers to move quickly across terrain where walking would have been painfully slow and physically exhausting. By spreading a person's weight over a much larger surface, skis prevented them from sinking deeply into the snow, conserving precious energy while making journeys that would otherwise have been almost impossible. Frozen lakes and rivers created new opportunities as well. The Vikings developed simple but remarkably effective skates made from carefully shaped animal bones secured beneath leather footwear. Unlike modern metal blades, these bone skates allowed people to glide across the ice while pushing themselves forward with wooden poles. Although primitive in appearance, they dramatically reduced the effort required to cross frozen waterways and helped maintain communication between settlements even during the harshest months of the year. Daily life continued because it had to. Livestock still required constant care. Timber still had to be cut and transported. Fishing remained an essential source of fresh food whenever conditions allowed. And families continued repairing buildings, making tools, weaving cloth, and preparing supplies for the seasons ahead. Winter was not a pause between productive months. It was another season that demanded its own knowledge, its own skills, and its own way of living. Every challenge created by the cold was answered with another practical solution, refined through generations of experience. Looking at these achievements individually, none of them fully explains how the Vikings survived in such an unforgiving environment. A well-insulated house alone would not have been enough. Neither would warm clothing, preserved food, or efficient winter transport. Their true strength came from combining every one of these ideas into a single system, where each solution reinforced the others. A warmer house reduced the amount of fuel required to heat it. Better clothing allowed people to work outdoors for longer without exhausting themselves. Reliable food preservation ensured that enough energy remained available throughout the winter, while effective methods of travel kept farms and settlements connected when snow and ice covered the landscape. That is why the Vikings accomplished something far more remarkable than simply surviving cold weather. They transformed one of Europe's harshest climates into a homeland where families could raise children, communities could prosper, trade could continue, and exploration could begin. The same knowledge that carried them safely through countless Scandinavian winters later allowed them to settle Iceland, establish colonies in Greenland, and venture across the North Atlantic in search of lands no Europeans had ever permanently inhabited before. Long before the world remembered them as fearless warriors or legendary explorers, the Vikings had already achieved something just as extraordinary. They had learned that the greatest victory over winter was never won by fighting the cold itself. It was won by building an entire civilization that knew how to live with it.